Who the System Could Not Control. A Life Behind Bars documentary. Every prison is built to control people. Most succeed. But over time, correctional systems encounter a problem they are not designed to solve easily. What happens when incarceration itself is no longer enough? What happens when bars, walls, routines, and supervision fail to stop violence, influence, or coordination? This documentary examines the small group of inmates who forced the system to confront those questions, and the institutional response that followed. If you value factual, long-form documentaries about prisons and the justice system, consider subscribing to Life Behind Bars. Your support allows us to continue producing in-depth stories like this one. What uncontrollable means in prison terms. In prison language, uncontrollable does not mean chaotic. It means resistant to standard management. Correctional systems are designed around predictability, scheduled movement, structured supervision, gradual escalation of restrictions. When an inmate repeatedly disrupts that structure, the system escalates its response. Uncontrollable is not a diagnosis. It is a classification, built from patterns, not single incidents. The limits of traditional control. Maximum security prisons are designed to manage risk through separation and supervision. They rely on controlled movement, segregation units, disciplinary sanctions, increased staffing. For most inmates, these tools work. But a small number continue to exert influence even under strict conditions. They adapt faster than the institution. Pattern 1. Persistent violence. One of the clearest paths toward extreme containment is repeated violence. Not isolated incidents, but ongoing behavior. This may include assaults on staff, attacks on other inmates, weapon fabrication, coordinated disturbances. When violence continues despite segregation, loss of privileges, and extended confinement, administrators face a dilemma. Escalation stops working. Pattern 2. Influence without direct action. Not all uncontrollable behavior is physical. Some inmates maintain influence without direct participation. Through communication, reputation, or organizational ties, they continue to shape events beyond their immediate surroundings. This influence can persist even when the inmate is locked down for most of the day. For administrators, this creates a unique challenge. You cannot restrain ideas the same way you restrain movement. Pattern 3. Organizational control. Correctional intelligence units track patterns across facilities. When inmates continue to direct or coordinate group activity, even indirectly, the concern shifts from individual behavior to systemic risk. At this point, the issue is no longer one inmate. It is the stability of the institution itself. Traditional segregation units are not designed to counter long-term organizational influence. When discipline fails. Before extreme measures are considered, prisons exhaust standard disciplinary tools. These include loss of privileges, extended segregation, transfer between facilities, increased monitoring. When these measures fail repeatedly, administrators begin to look for structural solutions rather than behavioral ones. This is the moment when control shifts from management to containment. The system's escalation path. Correctional systems escalate control in stages. Each stage assumes the previous one will work. When it doesn't, the system moves upward, not out of anger but necessity. By the time an inmate reaches the highest level of restriction, the decision is rarely based on a single act. It is based on a documented inability to contain risk through conventional means. The role of administrative decisions. No judge labels an inmate uncontrollable. That determination is administrative. Classification committees review behavior, intelligence reports, and institutional impact. Their focus is not punishment. It is whether the system can safely function with that inmate housed elsewhere. When the answer becomes no, the response is structural, not disciplinary. When transfers stop working. In most cases, prisons respond to persistent problems by transferring inmates. The logic is simple. New environment, new staff, new dynamics. For many inmates, transfers disrupt patterns of behavior. For a small group, they do not. Some individuals adapt quickly, learning the weaknesses of each new institution. Instead of resetting behavior, transfers become opportunities to reestablish influence. When this happens repeatedly, administrators reach a critical conclusion. The problem is not the facility. It is the inmate's ability to function within any standard environment. How influence survives restriction. Influence does not require physical presence. In some cases, it operates through communication. In others, through reputation alone. Correctional intelligence reports document instances where inmates continue to shape behavior without direct orders. Their standing within informal hierarchies carried weight. Restricting movement reduced opportunity, but did not eliminate authority. This is where traditional confinement models begin to fail. Isolation as a temporary solution. Segregation is often the first extreme response. Inmates are separated from the general population, movement is restricted, privileges are removed. In many cases, this works. But when segregation becomes long-term, it reveals its limits. Extended isolation may reduce immediate incidents, but it does not always diminish influence or intent. Administrators then face a dilemma. How do you contain someone who remains a risk even when removed from everyone else? When behavior becomes a systemic threat. At a certain point, the issue is no longer individual misconduct. It becomes systemic. If one inmate requires disproportionate resources, constant monitoring, or repeated emergency responses, the entire facility is affected. Staff safety is compromised. Other inmates are destabilized. Operations are disrupted. At this stage, decisions are made not about discipline, but about institutional survival. The shift from management to containment. Most prisons are designed to manage behavior. Containment is different. Containment assumes behavior will not change. Instead of shaping conduct, the goal becomes preventing impact. This shift marks a turning point in how the system views the inmate. Rehabilitation is no longer the priority. Risk reduction is. Designing for exceptions. Facilities designed for exceptional inmates are built differently. They minimize contact. They eliminate blind spots. They reduce reliance on human interaction. The design assumes worst-case behavior as the baseline. These environments are not meant to encourage growth. They are meant to prevent damage. Why standard prisons cannot adapt infinitely? Standard prisons are built around balance. Security exists alongside movement, programming, and limited interaction. Pushing these facilities beyond their design creates strain. Staff burnout increases. Incidents rise. Resources are stretched. At a certain point, adaptation stops being sustainable. This is when centralized solutions emerge. The creation of a final option. When no existing facility can safely manage a specific category of inmates, systems create a final option. A place designed not for many, but for a few. These facilities concentrate risk rather than distribute it. They represent an acknowledgement of limits. Not every individual can be managed within conventional structures. The cost of building around outliers. Designing prisons around extreme cases has consequences. Policies hardened for exceptions can influence broader practices. Isolation becomes normalized. Restrictions spread. Temporary measures become permanent. The system solves one problem and creates another. When a label becomes an identity. Inside prison systems, labels carry weight. Once an inmate is classified as high risk or uncontrollable, that designation follows them. It shapes housing decisions. It influences access to programs. It affects how staff approach every interaction. Over time, the label becomes more than an assessment. It becomes an identity imposed by the institution. Life under permanent assumptions. Facilities designed for extreme containment operate on a central assumption. Behavior will not improve. Every policy, schedule, and restriction is built around that belief. For inmates housed under these conditions, there is little opportunity to demonstrate change. Compliance becomes expected, not rewarded. Improvement does not necessarily translate into reduced restriction. How long-term containment reshapes behavior. When individuals are placed in environments where control is absolute, behavior adapts accordingly. Some withdraw completely. Others become hyper-controlled and rigid. Many learn to suppress visible reactions. Over time, the absence of choice alters how decisions are made. Initiative fades. Risk-taking disappears. Survival becomes passive. The system achieves stability, but at a psychological cost. The disappearance of incentives. In most prisons, incentives play a central role in behavior management. Privileges, programs, and movement are used to encourage compliance. In facilities designed for extreme containment, incentives are limited by design. When privileges cannot meaningfully expand, motivation shifts. Good behavior becomes maintenance, not progress. For many inmates, the future stops feeling negotiable. When release stops feeling real. For inmates held under extreme containment, release often becomes an abstract concept. Even when a sentence has a defined end, the path toward it feels disconnected from daily life. Days are governed by routine rather than progression, and there are few markers that suggest movement toward something different. Preparation for reintegration is limited. Opportunities to practice decision-making are rare. Social interaction remains minimal. Over time, the outside world stops feeling like a destination and starts feeling like a theory. Inmates may intellectually understand that release is possible, but emotionally, it no longer feels real. The skills required to function beyond confinement, navigating uncertainty, reading social cues, making independent choices, slowly erode through disuse. What remains is familiarity with control. The longer someone exists within an environment where every decision is made for them, the harder it becomes to imagine life without that structure. Freedom stops being anticipated and starts being feared. This is one of the least visible consequences of extreme containment, not the loss of liberty but the gradual loss of belief that liberty is attainable. The human cost of being unmanageable. Being classified as uncontrollable carries consequences beyond restriction. It narrows how the system sees the individual. Every action is interpreted through a lens of risk. Every request is evaluated for threat. Every deviation is treated cautiously. This constant assumption reshapes identity. Not because behavior worsens, but because opportunity disappears. When containment replaces change. Most correctional systems are built on the idea that behavior can be shaped. Extreme containment represents a departure from that belief. It accepts that change may never come, and builds policy around that acceptance. At that point, the goal is no longer improvement. It is insulation. Protecting the system from disruption becomes more important than altering behavior. The institutional consequences. Facilities built around extreme cases influence more than just the inmates inside them. They shape staff roles, training, and expectations. Interaction gives way to observation. Engagement gives way to protocol. Judgment gives way to procedure. Over time, the culture adapts to constant risk management. This shift does not stay contained forever. When exceptions become a model. Systems built for exceptions rarely stay isolated. Policies designed for the most difficult cases can spread outward. Isolation becomes easier to justify. Restrictions become more familiar. Containment becomes a reference point. What began as a solution for a few starts influencing how many are managed. Why the system accepts this trade-off? From an administrative perspective, the trade-off is clear. Extreme containment reduces immediate threats. It stabilizes institutions. It lowers unpredictable risk. The cost is long-term and diffuse, harder to measure, easier to defer. As long as the system prioritizes certainty, facilities designed for uncontrollable inmates will continue to exist. What this documentary reveals. The inmates described in this documentary are not defined by notoriety. They are defined by impact. Their presence exposed the limits of traditional incarceration. Their behavior forced systems to adapt, not by becoming more flexible but by becoming more rigid. The prisons that emerged were not accidents. They were deliberate responses to perceived failure. Facilities built for those the system could not control solved one problem. But they created another. Because once prisons are designed around total containment, a new question emerges. What happens when control itself becomes the defining feature of incarceration, and isolation is no longer reserved for exceptions? The human cost of being labeled unmanageable. Being classified as uncontrollable does more than change housing. It reshapes how an individual is perceived at every level of the institution. Once the label is applied, it influences how requests are evaluated, how behavior is interpreted, how future risk is assessed. Neutral actions are viewed cautiously. Improvement is treated as temporary. Compliance becomes expected rather than acknowledged. The label narrows possibility. When every action is filtered through risk. In high-control environments, risk assessment becomes constant. Every interaction is filtered through a single question. What could go wrong? This mindset is not malicious. It is defensive. But over time, it creates a feedback loop where trust is never rebuilt and change is never fully recognized. The system stops responding to who the inmate is and responds only to who they were. Long-term containment and identity erosion. Extended containment alters identity. When personal choice disappears, self-definition follows. Inmates adapt by becoming smaller versions of themselves, emotionally quieter, behaviorally neutral, socially withdrawn. This is not always despair. Often it is resignation. The safest way to exist in a total control environment is to leave as little trace as possible. The paradox of perfect control. From an institutional standpoint, extreme containment works. Violence drops. Coordination is prevented. predictability increases. But perfect control creates a paradox. The more behavior is suppressed, the less information the system has about genuine change. Without interaction, there is no way to measure growth. Without trust, there is no pathway out. Containment becomes self-perpetuating. When housing becomes a destination. For some inmates, placement in extreme containment was never meant to be permanent. Yet years pass. Transfers do not occur. Classifications remain unchanged. Reviews repeat the same conclusions. What began as a response becomes a destination. The system does not explicitly decide that someone will remain there forever. It simply never finds a reason to decide otherwise. The role of administrative inertia. Correctional systems rely heavily on precedent. Once a placement is justified, reversing it requires confidence and risk. Approving change exposes administrators to potential failure. Denying change does not. Over time, caution becomes policy. Extreme containment continues not because it is always reevaluated, but because it is rarely challenged. Whose safety matters most? Supporters of extreme containment emphasize safety. Staff safety. Inmate safety. Institutional stability. These concerns are real. Facilities designed for uncontrollable inmates were created in response to genuine harm. The ethical question is not whether safety matters, but how much isolation is justified in pursuit of it. The system's uncomfortable question. Extreme containment forces correctional systems to confront a question they rarely ask openly. What happens when control becomes the primary objective of incarceration? Prisons are designed to balance multiple goals: safety, order, rehabilitation, and eventual reintegration. Most policies assume that behavior can be shaped through structure, incentives, and supervision. But the inmates examined in this documentary challenged that assumption. Their behavior did not respond predictably to discipline. Their influence did not fade with isolation. Their presence disrupted institutions even under strict control. In response, the system adapted, not by becoming more flexible but by becoming more rigid. Extreme containment did not emerge as a philosophical choice. It emerged as a practical one. Yet once containment becomes the dominant response, a deeper question follows. If a system defines certain individuals as permanently unmanageable, what does that say about the system's capacity to change behavior at all? This is the uncomfortable boundary. Not between punishment and mercy, but between management and abandonment. Extreme containment accepts that some people will never be reintegrated into the normal logic of incarceration. It replaces the goal of change with the goal of insulation. Safety is achieved, but possibility narrows. And once a system accepts that outcome for a few, it quietly reshapes how risk is understood for everyone else. When system logic and human reality collide. At its core, extreme containment is a rational solution to an irrational problem. Correctional systems are designed to minimize uncertainty. Uncontrollable behavior represents uncertainty at its highest level. From an administrative standpoint, isolating risk appears logical. But logic does not exist in isolation. Every structural decision has a human consequence, whether acknowledged or not. Extreme containment solves for safety by narrowing possibility, not just for behavior but for change itself. The moment rehabilitation stops being the goal. Most correctional models are built on the assumption that behavior can be influenced. Programs, incentives, and progression exist to encourage improvement. Extreme containment represents a departure from that assumption. At a certain point, the system stops asking how to change behavior and begins asking only how to prevent harm. Rehabilitation does not disappear officially. It becomes irrelevant operationally. When time becomes the primary control. In environments of total control, time replaces force. There is no need for confrontation. No need for escalation. No need for negotiation. Routine governs everything. Days repeat. Weeks dissolve. Years pass without distinction. For the institution, this stability is success. For the individual, it becomes a slow narrowing of experience. The system's unwritten acceptance. Over time, systems adapt to their most extreme measures. What began as a response to rare cases becomes an accepted option. The existence of facilities designed for uncontrollable inmates changes how risk is perceived elsewhere. Instead of asking whether control can be improved, the system asks where risk can be relocated. Containment becomes not a last resort, but a reference point. The broader consequence no one owns. No single administrator designs the long-term outcome of extreme containment. It emerges gradually, through cautious decisions, through risk avoidance, through policies that prioritize certainty over possibility. Each choice appears reasonable in isolation. Together, they create a system where some individuals are no longer managed, they are simply held. What these cases really reveal: the inmates discussed in this documentary are not anomalies. They are indicators. They reveal where traditional incarceration reaches its limits, and how systems respond when those limits are exposed. The question is not whether these responses were justified. The question is what they have normalized. The line that quietly moves. When control becomes the highest value, the boundary between exception and standard begins to shift. Restrictions designed for the few influence the many. Policies meant to contain outliers reshape institutions. The line moves quietly, without announcement. And once it moves, it rarely moves back. Facilities built for those the system could not control were never meant to define incarceration. But over time, their logic spread. In the next documentary, we step inside environments where isolation is no longer the exception, and examine what life becomes when separation itself is the system. The inmates examined in this episode forced the system to confront its limits. When traditional incarceration failed, control replaced change, and containment became the solution. What followed reshaped not just individual lives, but the structure of incarceration itself. In the next episode, we step inside the environments created by that shift, and examine what life becomes when isolation is no longer temporary but permanent. Thank you for watching Life Behind Bars.